It is such an honor to be back again with ICANotes. Hello, everyone, wonderful helpers. We're so glad that you're joining us today. Thank you for being here as we're going to be looking at exploring adverse childhood experiences. And this is an area that I think we're probably all on some level familiar with, but today we're going to spend time looking at how we can support clients, especially in these areas that you see here on the screen. You see our learning objectives. And what we're going to focus on today in the training is how we can use ACEs scores to guide our understanding of a client's history without reducing them to a number or reinforcing the deficit based view of their identity. We're going to really look at how we can remain person centered and stay within this lens of being trauma informed. We're also going to look at how we can integrate the ACEs into treatment planning and support clients. And then finally, we'll look at some script examples of how we can dialogue with clients about the ACEs. As Angela mentioned, the materials are available in the handouts tab. There you will find both the slide, which have a lot of great information, and then you'll also find the resource links and handouts. There's many resources I provided you with. I've been called the resource queen, which is a crown that I wear very proudly because I think as clinicians, it's important for us to have several clinical resources at our disposal. And so I hope that you find the handouts and resources helpful. Love to see you all introducing yourself, and we welcome your chatting with us here throughout the training. I'd like to begin by offering us a metaphor to begin to give us some context here to adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences are like a young tree growing in a storm. The winds of loss and trauma bend its branches, sometimes breaking a few, while the rain of fear soaks deep into its roots. For a time, the tree grows crooked and scarred, reaching for light through the shadows. But over the years, the same storms that once threatened to uproot it also teach it to hold fast, to dig deeper, to find nourishment even in rocky soil. With care, sunlight, and patience, new growth appears, stronger, steadier, and reaching skyward again. Its shape tells a story not only of what was lost, but of resilience, recovery, and the enduring hope that a future forest can still flourish. I love being able to look at adverse childhood experiences as being significant in some of our clients' lives, and also, as we see here with this tree, a metaphor for growth and resilience and being able to still reach for the sunlight and still being able to thrive, despite the fact that tree has scars and has a history of being wounded. I'd like to introduce you to Maria. Let's look at Maria's case presentation, and then we will follow up with Maria towards the end of the training. Maria is a 32-year-old woman with an ACEs score of 8. As a child, she was exposed to multiple adverse experiences, including physical abuse, domestic violence, parental substance use, and neglect. In adulthood, Maria presents with chronic anxiety and symptoms of depression, along with difficulty maintaining relationships due to distrust and hypervigilance. Physically, Maria has been diagnosed with hypertension and type 2 diabetes, conditions her primary care provider notes may be linked to chronic stress and health risk behaviors, smoking and emotional eating that developed as coping strategies. She reports frequent migraines and poor sleep, which exacerbate her mood difficulties. Maria has also struggled with alcohol misuse, particularly during times of heightened stress. Her ACEs history highlights the strong association between early adversity and adult outcomes, including increased risk of cardiovascular disease, substance use, and mental health disorders, emphasizing the need for trauma-informed approaches in both healthcare and mental health settings. As we see with Maria's case, she has many different parts of her ACEs score that have led to some vulnerabilities, both in her mental health and then also in her physical health as well. And this may describe a lot of the clients that we work with when we identify perhaps that they do have somewhat of a remarkable ACEs score. Let's watch this brief video. It's just a few minutes on understanding ACEs.
Adverse childhood experiences, called ACEs, are stressful or traumatic experiences that occur in childhood, like violence, abuse, and growing up in a family with substance use or mental health problems. When a caring adult or supportive environment doesn't soften those adverse experiences, or when they are ongoing or overwhelming, they can lead to a prolonged activation of our stress response, called toxic stress. Think of toxic stress like this. Our bodies were designed to escape predators quickly. Imagine you're walking through the woods and you see a bear. Your brain signals your body to release stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. Your heart begins to pound and your body prepares you to either fight or run from the bear. And that's useful if you're in the forest and there's a bear. The problem is when children face threats to their physical and emotional safety, and this system is activated over and over again. What was meant to protect you begins to do the opposite and becomes damaging to your health, creating long-lasting wear on your body and brain. Children are especially vulnerable to the effects of ACEs and toxic stress because their brains and bodies are still developing. The toxic stress from ACEs and other adversities such as poverty, racism, discrimination, and natural disasters can disrupt the normal functioning of vital bodily systems. Simply put, toxic stress can result in long-term mental and physical health conditions. Not only that, but the effects of ACEs can be passed from parent to child for generations through the biological changes and behaviors associated with ACEs and toxic stress. A person with 4 or more ACEs is twice as likely to suffer from heart disease, cancer, and stroke, 4 times as likely to develop depression, and 12 times as likely to attempt suicide. The good news is that safe, stable relationships and environments and other interventions such as physical and mental health support can reduce the risk of ACEs leading to toxic stress and stress-related health conditions. To learn more, visit www.osg.ca.gov.
Thank you, Angela, for playing that video. So that gives us an overview, as we saw with Maria's case, of the reality of ACEs. And we also get this glimmer of optimism, hope, resilience as we see. And we're really going to emphasize that as we talk about the ways in which we can support clients that may have a high ACEs score. Let's take a look. And for some of us, this may be a reacquainting with the ACEs. For some of you, this may be new in terms of looking at the ACEs model here. So this is what the adverse childhood experiences looks like. Let me give you a little bit of a history here on the ACEs. Back in the late 90s, Kaiser Permanente, who at the time was a large insurance company, they administered the ACEs to about 17,000 of their members. And they were very surprised at the results. What they found in the results was that about 35% of the respondents had 4 or more ACEs. As we heard in the video, 4 or more ACEs can lead to an increased risk in some of these physical and mental health areas. They also found that about 15% of the respondents had 7 or more ACEs. And so this was the beginning of our understanding of how adverse childhood experiences begin to shape health and mental health. Let's take a look at what we are identifying in the ACEs as you see it here. And I've included in your handouts the ACEs actual assessment instrument, so you can actually utilize that. We're looking at this before the age of 18. So this is within children is really when we're wanting to get an idea of these experiences. You can see here we want to get an idea of substance use, lived with someone who was a problem drinker or used either illicit street drugs, or abused prescription drugs. We also want to identify if the child at the time of when they were a child lived with someone who was depressed, mentally ill, or suicidal. And so, by the way, we are typically giving 1 point for each of the yeses here. And so, the more yeses, the more how we're getting to the points in the aces. We also want to identify if somebody has served time that is living with this child in prison, has been incarcerated. Those are the first kind of categories of the aces we see on the left. Then in the middle of the screen, here is when we're looking at, for example, domestic violence. Has the child lived with a parent or adult who slapped, hit, kicked, punched, or beat each other up? We know the exposure to domestic violence can be really detrimental for children. Also, has the parent or other adults in the home who did hit, beat, kick, or physically hurt you as a child before you were age 18? And then also, we want to identify verbal abuse, is where you see that blue emoji there, is identifying maybe not physical abuse that was experienced, but verbal and emotional abuse. On the right, we have the ACEs regarding parents who are separated or divorced, also looking at the experience of sexual abuse for this person as a child. And then we also look at different types of sexual abuse, as you see mentioned here, forcible sex, and anything along that continuum. We want to get an identification of that. So this is where we begin to have an idea of the foundation of how the ACEs began. And this is often the instrument that we still utilize. I'm curious from those of you in the audience, how many of you administer the ACEs screening to your clients as part of your assessment or clinical process? Feel free to share in the chat. How do you administer or use the ACEs in your practice? Love to hear examples from you all as clinicians. As you're sharing in the chat, I also wanted to move us to the next slide, which is going to broaden our understanding of the original ACEs. So the original ACEs was designed to capture the experiences of a child within their home environments as they were growing up. But we then expanded the ACEs, as you can see here, and was referenced in the video, that we also want to consider things that are below the surface. Again, we have the tree metaphor. And so we're looking at the experience, the exposure of violence, poverty, racism, lack of affordable housing, discrimination. So ACEs is not just what happened to that person in the context of their home environment, but also looking at the community exposure. And so we can expand the ACEs to also consider the individual's experiences in their community and in their environment. Let me see what you all have shared here in the chat. Thank you so much for being willing to share. Thank you, Kristen. You do this as part of your intake. Some of you are saying that, Monica, and then Dale, you're also saying as part of the mental health evaluation. Marcy, thanks for being here. You said every new client gets an ACEs and you review it often because they can minimize their experiences or might underreport. Yes, thank you for that. Hi, Tyrone from Kansas. I'm in Missouri, so we're neighbors. You give them the assessment at your initial appointment. Yes. Thank you, Lucinda, for being here. You're a retired social worker and has never heard of ACEs. So we're really glad that you're here to learn more about ACEs. And even being retired, there's still value in having the context of how ACEs are very important for us to have an idea of and have some context with our clients. I see a lot of you saying that you do incorporate ACEs in your intake or at the beginning of treatment. And you said, Georgina, that you do it as more formally as therapy surfaces in terms of connections. Yes. And then Tanisha, thank you so much. You said group discussion on identifying ACEs. So some great examples. You can see that a lot of clinicians do integrate ACEs into their intake or into their orientation, getting to know their clients. And this can give us an idea of their experiences. As you see above the surface are the original areas of ACEs that we focused on. And we are also being encouraged from a trauma-informed perspective to explore the ACEs below the surface. And these have a different title. They're also called ACEs, but they are adverse community environments. So above the surface is adverse childhood experiences. Below the surface is adverse community environment experiences. And both are important in our formulation and understanding a client's experiences. How do the ACEs inform things such as, for example, substance use? So as we look here on our next slide, you can see that we see some of the results of some of these moderate to high ACEs scores in some individuals, not all individuals, but there's more of a likelihood based on the research that, as we see with Maria in the case study, that individuals can experience both physical and mental health repercussions and consequences and symptoms and conditions based on their ACEs experiences. And you see some of these listed here. I wanted to highlight some of these statistics that I pulled from some sources such as SAMHSA, NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse, that give us some context of the vulnerability of some of our clients with substance use. Individuals that have 4 ACEs have a 500% increased risk of adult alcoholism. Also, 4 ACEs have been found to connect with a 1,300% increase in adult IV drug use. And then 6 ACEs, a 4,600% increase in adult IV drug use. Does this mean that every person that has 6 ACEs is going to develop IV drug use? No. But what it means is that there's certainly, as you see here with these percentages, a much higher likelihood of there being an impact with substance use. And then we know that anywhere between 42 to 95% of people coming into treatment for addiction do report a trauma history. And so that connection, just being able to make that connection, especially if you do work in substance use, you're probably already acquainted with the reality that a lot of people that have developed a substance use addiction do report to us that they had some type of adverse childhood experience, either the ACEs in their home or those community ACEs or those community ACEs that we just looked at. Thank you, Laura. You work in general peds and do not formally utilize it, but you are aware of its impact, which is great. Even if you don't formally utilize the ACEs, having some professional and clinical awareness and sensitivity to the ACEs is very valuable, even if you're not formally implementing it into your practice. We're going to take a look at a case study with a man named Justin, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on what do you think might be the next steps and therapeutic approaches. Let's take a look at this case study. Justin is 28 and has an ACEs score of 7. He has been exposed to domestic violence, parental substance misuse, and emotional neglect. He reports chronic anxiety, difficulty managing relationships, and frequent migraines. Justin states, "I feel like my body is always on edge, and I don't trust anyone to stick around." He has never been in counseling before and expresses uncertainty about whether therapy can actually help. He worries that talking about the past will make things worse, but also says he is tired of carrying it all. So I'd love to hear from you all. If you want to share in the chat, that would be fabulous. What would be your next steps? How might you begin building safety and trust with this client, given his high ACEs score and ambivalence about therapy? What are your thoughts here on what would be your next steps based on Justin's history and the statements that he has made? How might you proceed? Maybe some of you have had clients similar to Justin before. Yes, Laura, actually, I have seen that research. The research that looks at unresolved childhood trauma being a contributor, a possible contributor to the development of Alzheimer's. We already know that the presence of chronic depression can lead to vulnerability in developing Alzheimer's. So there's more emerging research that looks at early childhood trauma and begins to make that connection. Yes. Let's see what you all have to say here in the chat of next steps. Thank you so much, Suzanne. You said, assure Justin that this is his therapy and you would not do anything that he's uncomfortable with. So, being very person centered, being very collaborative, letting Justin direct the therapy and working together to figure out where you're going to be going in what direction. That's probably going to be very important with a client like Justin, who's never been in counseling and is somewhat reticent. And we want to make sure that we are being very collaborative and we are engaging in those trauma-informed care principles. Absolutely. Thank you, Petunia, so much. Discuss purpose and goals. Ashley, great point. Assure that he is in a safe space and find things to build rapport in over the first few sessions. Creating that psychological safety, so very important. And then Shirel, we want to make sure that we are viewing the client as the expert in their own lives. They are in the driver's seat. We are in the passenger seat. And then Karen, going along with this person-centered and client-directed approach, how would he like to continue? The other thing we can do here with Justin is we can provide some validation. We can mention to Justin that we understand his hesitancy and we've had other clients come to counseling that also have felt that same way, and that we are here to gently guide him and work with him together in the process. I think validating and normalizing how he's feeling coming into counseling would also be very important. I love that, Laura. Ask him to give an explanation of what trust would look like to him. And then Kristen, we always want the client to be in control of whether or not they want to talk about their trauma. We don't want to force them or pull that out of them. We want them to feel comfortable sharing anything with us. And then the next question, what are you all thinking might be some good therapeutic approaches with Justin? What are you considering just based on his profile? Now that we've had these first maybe 1 or 2 sessions, what modalities or therapeutic approaches might you lean into with a client like Justin? Shannon, you said strengths-based. And then Valerie, you're echoing my point about the importance of normalizing his feelings, discussing the therapeutic relationship. Love that. And then Larry, you're commenting that almost all of your clients have these ACEs, usually parental, emotional, and physical abuse. Thank you, Georgina. Appreciate that. Great thoughts there. Laura, maybe some narrative therapy and exercise in either the empty chair exercise, which would be Gestalt therapy, or narrative therapy, creating narration and stories and being able to share those in a safe space with you or another support person. Petunia, you're thinking about CBT and maybe some DBT as well. And then Karen, you're also mentioning motivational interviewing. I also would be interested to explore with Justin some somatic experiencing, maybe not right away, but looking at maybe integrating maybe a simple grounding exercise, being able to help begin to teach Justin and coach him and support him and learning some ways to safely connect with his body. I love everything that you all are saying, Linda. Trauma-focused ACT. And that's where we can pull in some of those mindful grounding exercises, EBT. And Tamara, as you're saying, exercises of containment and safety. The circle question, Marcy. Marcy, do you mind sharing for those that don't know what the circle question is? Just giving a brief description of what that is? That is great. Thank you also, Larry. Yeah, and the miracle question. So Marcy, some solution-focused approaches here with Justin, right? If you were to wake up tomorrow and a miracle had happened and your anxiety and your stress was not here anymore or is greatly reduced, what would you be doing? Talk me through your day. How would your day be different? Oh, Marcy, you mean the miracle question. Thank you for that. Great ideas, yes, of how, from a trauma informed perspective, we can support Justin and approach him in a way that is gentle and aligns with those trauma informed principles: safety, collaboration, accounting for any cultural, gender, or other identity pieces of Justin that he might want to share. All of those very important. Let's shift gears a little bit and let's talk about dialoguing with clients about the ACEs. One of the questions that I sometimes get asked is, how do I talk to my clients about the ACEs, about adverse childhood experiences? How do I dialogue with them about their score? So I wanted to share some examples of how we might do that with clients that do align with these trauma-informed care principles. And thank you, Monica. Love the mention of EMDR, which can really be very effective, combining some of the body-based work along with some of the cognitive work as well. So our first two scripts, as you see here, is introducing the ACEs. Let's look at this example first. This is something we might say to a client as we're introducing the ACEs. The ACEs tool looks at different types of stress or adversity that can happen in childhood, like experiences of abuse, neglect, or family challenges. It's not a test or a diagnosis, but rather a way of helping us understand how early experiences can affect health and well-being over time. So that's just one example. I encourage you to find your own comfortable verbiage, but I wanted to offer you just a way in which we can intentionally present the ACEs, clarifying it's not a diagnosis or a test, but here is the purpose of this tool and what it's going to help us do together. Notice I didn't say what it's going to help me do for you, but what it's going to help us do together. Oh yeah, Georgina, the family genogram, going back to the Justin case study, may also be very helpful. Yes. Now let's imagine that you have done the ACEs with a client and now you have a score. One of the other challenges for us as clinicians is, how do we effectively dialogue with a client after we've completed the ACEs and have a score? Here's what we might say. Your score came out in the moderate to high range. What that means is that you've experienced several of these stressful events growing up. Research shows that the more ACEs a person has, the higher the chances can be for challenges later on: anxiety, depression, relationship difficulties, even physical health conditions, such as high blood pressure or diabetes. So we're providing facts. We are just generalizing and saying sometimes a higher score may result in some of these life challenges. And that's how we're framing these, not as diagnoses, not as problems, or not as deficits, but as challenges, which is still a strengths-based way to present the realities of ACEs experiences. Let's look at two more scripts as we're continuing our dialogue with a particular client. Our next dialogue is on normalizing and empowering, which is a very important part of the ACEs discussion. Here's what we could say. However, it's important to remember, ACEs do not determine your future. They highlight risk, not destiny. Many people with high ACEs scores go on to live healthy, meaningful lives. What makes the biggest difference are protective factors, supportive relationships, coping skills, and access to resources. Therapy is one way to build those supports. And you could even add on to this and say, and I would love to work with you on discovering other ways that you can find support and strength and resources in your life. And that leads us into the collaboration script. So rather than focusing only on the number, let's use this information as a starting point. We can look at how your past experiences may still be impacting you today. And we'll also focus on strengths and strategies to help you feel safe, resilient, and in control of your healing moving forward. What do you all think of these scripts? Could you imagine using these as a progressive dialogue with your client? If you have administered the ACEs, you now have a score, and you're wanting to effectively, again, from this trauma informed perspective, have a very sensitive and appropriate dialogue with your clients. I hope they're helpful to give us the framework for how we begin to have conversations with our clients. Let's talk about treatment recommendations. So, these are the most recommended treatment recommendations, as we have been talking about some of these already. And some of you have mentioned the importance, again, if we go back to our client, Justin, the importance of establishing safety and trust. How do we establish both psychological and physical safety for our clients, especially those that do have a trauma or ACEs history? And like Justin, are unsure about counseling, they don't know what to expect, and they've never had a relationship or exposure to a counselor. And from that first interaction, it really matters how the environment is set up for safety and how we ourselves as the clinician is bringing forward a sense of safety. We also want to engage in trauma-informed psychotherapy. So all of those models that you all mentioned earlier, CBT, DBT, solution-focused narrative, EMDR, motivational interviewing, IFS, we could go on and on, right? They're all wonderful modalities if they are utilized with a trauma-informed lens. And so that should be the foundation, regardless of the modalities that you're using to support clients and the actual therapy. We always want to make sure that they are in alignment with being trauma-informed. Mind-body approaches. So there's such a value in somatic work and gradually helping a client titrate into some somatic work into the session, even if it's just for a few minutes, and then practicing some of these mind-body approaches when they're outside of the counseling room and being able to utilize those in their life. What about integrated healthcare? Collaborating with other providers, with physicians and nurses and physical therapists and the pharmacist and the case manager and any other individuals that may be on the treatment team, and the importance of being able to support the client in having them have many different providers that they're working with. We also look at substance use support, again, going back to those statistics of ACEs and looking at the increased risk of vulnerability for substance use. And so that is something we want to be aware of as clinicians, is what are the resources for substance use support if we're not providing that directly? The social support, resilience building, and of course, psychoeducation on ACEs, both the adverse childhood experiences and the adverse community experiences as well. If you would like some specific recommendations in each of these treatment areas, I've provided those in the resource links, which is one of your handouts, which you will find in the handouts tab. So lots of more specific suggestions in each of these areas. Thank you, Teresa. You have a client in her late 20s who seems not to identify feelings or any sense of hope. Excuse me. He is stuck in the mud for years. Getting him unstuck is challenging, but he seems to baby step. Any ideas of how to move forward before insurance runs out? Teresa, have you done any values exploration work with this client from the ACT perspective? Have you explored your client's values with him? If you have not, that would be an area that I would suggest that you go into, because sometimes when clients are stuck, it helps us to connect them with their values and how their values may lead to value-directed living. And the first part there is identifying values. And you said, Teresa, yes, and he cannot identify them. The other direction you may want to go in, Teresa, is exploring secondary gains. What are the benefits that your client receives of remaining in this identity and not unstucking himself? Because there are secondary gains. We just need to identify what those are. And if a client is stuck, they can't identify values, and they're not moving forward, there are often, and they may be subconscious secondary gains of reasons why they are motivated to stay in this space rather than move into a new space. The other thing you might be able to do if you've not done already is identify some of those core beliefs that are leading to the paralyzation and the lack of momentum and the lack of progress. Those would be some suggestions I have. If any of you have suggestions for Teresa based on the client she shared, feel free to share in the chat. So we want to balance ACEs with resilience. We want to acknowledge that there's the reality of the ACEs and the experiences that our clients had as a child. And we also want to be able to highlight resilience. So there's some ways that we can do that. One of the ways is we can administer the post-traumatic growth inventory. I believe I included that in your handouts, if I remember correctly. The post-traumatic growth inventory is going to assess how a client is growing in some key areas in their life. And so that is a useful tool that moves us away from the symptoms of trauma and the symptoms of adversity and more into post-traumatic growth. We also want to encourage a growth mindset. So I like to, for example, the metaphor that I shared with you earlier, creating a metaphor for your client that acknowledges what they've experienced in their ACEs and then also encourages optimism, this growth mindset, growing around adversity rather than trying to ignore or get rid of your adversity. Growing around your diversity is part of the growth mindset. And then using ACEs as a tool and not a label. And we can reinforce that with a client verbally that we're using this information as a tool and as context, but not as a label. We're not labeling you and we're not saying that because you have this score, this is going to be your life or your experience. And then we also need to normalize variability in outcomes. And there's a lot of variability in ACEs outcomes. Somebody can have a low ACEs score and develop psychological distress later in life. Somebody can have a high ACEs score and never develop psychological or even physical health conditions or mental health conditions. So there's lots of variables in the ACEs. Nothing is certain and nothing is guaranteed based on a score. Thank you, Georgina. The metaphor of the caterpillar and the chrysalis and eventually flying away, filled with life force. You resurrect that imagery often, and most clients find that it's helpful. Yes, as long as we manage the heat. Love that, Georgina. I love any metaphor. So anytime anybody shares a metaphor, I'm going to love it. That is great. And thank you for sharing that with the group. Let's look at some case examples of how we can begin to highlight resilience and encourage a growth mindset. We're going to look at case examples of most of these points that you see here on the screen. And our first example is Alana, who's 29, has a score, ACEs score of 7, and reports a history of childhood neglect and parental incarceration. Despite this adversity, she's completed college, volunteers, and identifies her own spirituality as a source of strength. Here are some of the actions that the therapist might take that align with the trauma-informed principles and also can use the ACEs as a tool for this resilience and protective factors. We can use the post-traumatic growth inventory, administer that with Alana, reinforce her resilience by looking at how she's built these community connections and pursued her education. So let's go back in time and let's identify how Alana was able to do this. What are the steps? What did she do? Who were the support people, the mentors? How did she survive the challenging times or the times that she wanted to give up? That is where we're going to begin to highlight her resources and her resilience and protective factors. The other thing I want to do here that's not mentioned is how could we perhaps highlight her spirituality and view that as a resource and see how her spirituality helps her make sense of what happened to her as a child or be comforted or have some space from what happened to her as a child and have places where she can go to receive support, comfort, and refuge. Lots of options here with this particular client. Let's look at our next client, who is Deshaun. Deshaun is 16 and has an ACEs score of 6. He believes he is broken because of his family's history of violence and substance misuse. He avoids challenges in school, fearing failure. Now, coming from the growth mindset, one of the things that we could do with Deshaun is we can introduce the concept of the growth mindset. The way that I like to do this is I get out a piece of paper and I draw a circle in the middle of the piece of paper and I write in the circle trauma, your history, ACEs, whatever, anything in that category. You write that in the middle circle in the piece of paper. Then I draw a large circle around this small circle with plenty of space. And I write on the outside of the circle, in this case, Deshaun, the name of my client. And what I want to do with this exercise is I want to acknowledge what is inside the small circle. And I also want to help my client, Deshaun, begin to look at his life through the lens of this growth mindset. Yes, your trauma, your family's history, that is part of you. And you're carrying that with you in a backpack or in your pocket. But I'm wondering what we can fill up in the space outside of this circle in the middle. Tell me about who else Deshaun is. Tell me about other parts of Deshaun's story. Tell me about supportive, safe people in Deshaun's life. Tell me about successes or achievements that Deshaun has had. And that is a way in which we can begin to encourage a client like Deshaun to acknowledge what he has experienced and what is part of his history, and also begin to give space and acknowledge and write down who else is Deshaun, which encourages this growth mindset. We could also use narrative therapy to help Deshaun rewrite his story. In narrative therapy, we typically create the problem story, which Deshaun could probably easily create. He could easily create and write his problem story. And then once we've given the space and the narration of the problem story, then we could move Deshaun into creating what we call the preferred story. And we want to help Deshaun thicken this preferred story. What do I want my life to be? What parts of growth have I experienced? What are my resources? Who are my supportive people? What do I envision for my future? What is one of my dreams? And by creating this preferred story and thickening it, reading it, connecting with it, we can really emphasize and begin to build this growth mindset. Let's look at one more example. We have Maya, who is 34 and has an ACEs score of 10, and she's feeling discouraged after reading about the risks tied to high ACEs. She fears she's destined for poor health and relationship struggles. This is where we want to really emphasize with Maya that ACEs are a screening tool, not a diagnostic label. I would go back and I would use that script that we looked at earlier that really gives a good explanation of what is the purpose of ACEs. We also would be able to emphasize that ACEs highlights risk, but outcomes are going to depend on many different scenarios. The other thing that I would encourage you all to do is if you have a client like Maya who is discouraged by her ACEs score, have ready to share as an example a client who you've worked with that has a high ACEs score and has been able to achieve healthy relationships, employment, education. They have solid, stable mental health. Provide your client, a client like Maya, with a quick anecdotal story of, Maya, I understand how you're feeling, and I recognize that you are feeling a little bit hopeless because of your high ACEs score. I'm wondering if I could share with you that I have a few clients like you that also have had high ACEs scores, and they're actually doing well now. They have a job, they've been able to create a family, They have hobbies in life. They have a life worth living that is not consumed by their history and not consumed by their ACEs score. So that is something I would encourage you to do, because the normalization of bringing in that you have other clients like Maya with a high ACEs score that are actually doing well, that can be very impactful. And then Laura, using support groups and guided anger work. Great suggestion. Yes. How can we work with Maya from a strengths-based, solution-focused perspective that doesn't just focus on deficits, problems, weaknesses, challenges? We're focusing on strengths, capabilities, resources, options, possibilities, and hopes. Great point, Georgina. Thank you for that. We also want to normalize variability in outcomes. So this is Victor has an ACEs score of 8 and compares himself to his siblings that have similar ACEs scores, but fewer health challenges. He feels ashamed that he has not done as well. So the comparative analysis, and you see these suggestions here, normalizing, reducing shame, that would probably be a focus of working with Victor here, and highlighting that healing is possible at any stage, regardless of trajectories. Remember Maria from our earlier point in the training? This is Maria's background, just to give you a reminder. Her score was 8. And you see here that we're breaking down what her experiences are in each of these domains: mental health, physical health, behavioral health, and clinical implications. So from a clinical perspective, this is just something I have found helpful, is just being able to break up, once we have the ACEs score, what is this client's experience in each of these 4 core areas that you see here. Also, just some key points here in terms of looking at ACEs. We acknowledge that a high ACEs score may increase risk in some areas. We also still can support resilience, this growth mindset we talked about. We also want to acknowledge that early experiences of abuse and neglect can lead to isolation. And that is why, as was just mentioned, Laura, support groups, peers. Peers is one of the SAMHSA trauma-informed guidelines, is peers and helping connect our clients to peers with lived experience. That can often help people feel like they're not alone, and there are other people that also have similar struggles. The last point I want to emphasize, the ACEs framework sheds light on patterns of adversity, and it must be paired with an emphasis on strengths, post-traumatic growth, and the possibility of thriving. Also wanted to recommend this great workbook if you're interested, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Recovery Workbook. Really great workbook if you're interested in making this somewhat of a focus of your work with clients. And you can see here we have another metaphor: healing from trauma and high ACEs is like tending to a forest after a wildfire. The flames may have destroyed trees, scorched the soil, and left scars on the land, but beneath the surface, seeds of resilience remain. Recovery takes time, care, and the right conditions: water, sunlight, and protection from further harm. Slowly, new growth emerges: strong trees, flowering plants, and healthy soil. Some areas may always bear the marks of fire, but the forest can become vibrant, thriving, and even more diverse than before. In the interest of time, I won't show the second video, but you have that as a link. It's just a 2-minute video on the growth and the resilience after ACEs, as we've just been talking about. Also wanted to just mention as we are closing that you have all of these handouts. If you click on the handouts tab, this is where you will find them: the ACEs questionnaire, some ACEs Plus questions, general recommendations, treatment recommendations for Maria, and the ACEs domains relevant clinical considerations, and then ACEs and cultural considerations, and you have some client examples. So feel free to check out all of those handouts. Also wanted to mention before I say goodbye to you all, that I have some on-demand courses that are available if you're interested in some on-demand, learn at your own pace CEUs. You can find those on my website, dianebiglertraining.com. I want to thank you all so much for being here. And thank you so much for all of your thoughts and all of your input here in this training on ACEs. I'm going to turn it over to October, who is going to close us out. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye bye.
Thank you so much. You did an amazing job as always, as absolutely always. I think that, and you can tell by the chat that everybody loved the webinar. So I just want to thank you for just sharing what you do on the Adverse Childhood Experience Study and the ACE scores. I think that it was very informative. Again, I just want to thank you for sharing your expertise and taking the time to present to our community. We are thrilled to have tools in ICANotes that support the best practices you discussed. And I believe your presentation really truly enforced how clinicians can use them to enhance both the clinical care and also compliance. So I'm going to share my screen a little bit, show you in ICANotes what that looks like. And as you can see from the chat, it's blown up. It's absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much for recognizing her. She's amazing. So let's go ahead. I'm going to share my screen. And just out of curiosity, if you're a classic customer, you're going to be like, that doesn't look like my ICANotes. This is ICANotes Plus. It is the new ICANotes. We call it Plus. And so it does look a little bit different than the classic program. There's a lot of the classic functionality in this, but then it's also upgraded a little bit as well. So as you can see, this was what your dashboard looks like. You've got your progress notes, tells you which ones you've started but haven't compiled, and those that you've compiled but you haven't signed, and all of your notes total. And it goes through, and it's very quick. As you can see, it'll tell you every 12 months how many you've done. But it's really good in helping you just keep up with your notes. Lots of folks have problems with keeping up with their notes. So this is something that will help that. We've got a calendar. One of the nice features about our calendar is you can have your quick share scheduling link. You can put that right on your website so people can book in at the times that you want them to book in for them to get appointments. This is really helpful, especially if you're looking for new client or patients. Really helpful there. We also, as you can tell, our chart face looks a little bit different, more modern per se. And one of the things that's really nice in our communication tab and in the client portal is that I can select forms to send out. So if I have packages like an intake package, I can pull that up and send that directly to my patient. We also have the general assessments that you can send to your patients as well, like pre-screening forms. And then we have assessments in there. We drop all the ones that you want in there, and I can just send that out to my client. And then when they fill it out, it alerts in the chart, but also gives me a little notification at the top so that they completed their paperwork. So you're not shuffling papers. That's really helpful. Those are two features that I just showed you that we don't have in Classic. So the online scheduling and then the ability to send forms through the portal right here. Now, one of the features, ICANotes Plus has more advanced features than Classic, but one of the things that people love is in the portal, you have the ability for people to fill out their assessment, and they can share their social history, their past psych history, their family history, and that can populate into your note if you want it to. And so that's a really nice feature. So less documentation. I want to take you to the chart face, and I'll show you, I have that. There we go. Little forms and assessments here. If I go, we have lots of different practice forms. Your custom forms goes in here. If you're wondering, you're like, I have forms. How much is it going to cost? For us to put your forms in, it's free. So it's free of charge in Plus. And so we have clinician rated assessments. And when I go into the clinician rated assessments, there we will see the ACE. So here is that questionnaire. I can go ahead and create that. It will load up this questionnaire for me. And then we can fill that out in the system. And then we also have the ability, we have SOAP notes. So if you like SOAP notes, you can go in on a SOAP note and I can say symptoms reported, and maybe they're having a lot of anxiety. And I could talk about some of the things like maybe they're having nausea and panic and racing heart rate and shaking. One of the nice things here that I can go in is I have my content edit mode. I'm able to put in custom content. Let me just show you really quick. I'll put custom. very easy to create custom content. So I want you to be thinking about ways you would use this, like verbatim sentences that you use. And so I'm going to say custom button, and I'll save that. And then I can even move that to the very top there. And then there's my custom. And and you're like, I don't want to do that in every chart. You don't have to. You do it in one chart. It's in everybody's chart. So really nice way of documenting here within the system. Then I could also go in and maybe I can say they also have some depression that's going on. They're feeling hopeless and helpless. There is social withdrawal, and then there is feelings of worthlessness. All right. Then I could go into current stressors. I could say they're having problems at work. They're having personality conflicts and loss of job is possible. They're having problems with their relationship. Maybe separation has occurred. They're having financial problems, right? And then they are having Medicaid problems or legal problems. I can put that in there. Then I can go to objective and I can talk about their symptoms observed. So completely different, right? With depression, I'm going to say that they have no suicidal thoughts, but they are having concentration issues. I can talk about behavior, that their self-care is maybe reduced. I could say their anger is poorly controlled and impulses are poorly controlled, and their medication compliance is irregular. Then I'm able to go into the assessment part. If they're doing really well, you can click mental status exam, and then I can give a normal, and it will give me a completely normal mental status exam. In this area, I can type to my heart's content. So you're like, I don't want to use the buttons, I want to type. You can absolutely do that. If they've completed rating scales like that ACE, it will pull them in. And so you will see that they have a rating scale and you can automatically populate that in. So it's really helpful. If they filled out like a PHQ-9, maybe while they were sitting there waiting on you in the office, you can document that. And when we have our suicide violence risk assessment, we also have our plan where you can link in the treatment plan. So I can go to their treatment plan. I can select from the list anxiety. I can select interventions here. Maybe I just want to bring 2 of those in, and I can link those in. And then if you're dealing with Medicaid, Medicare, or insurance companies that require treatment planning, they always want to know how the treatment plan is going. I'm going to say it's doing good, and what you're doing with the treatment plan. We're going to continue it because if it's not, you can also add that in there as well. So I've linked that treatment plan in, and then I can justify level of care, and I'll put that right into the history, and I'll say that outpatient is still needed because it's interfering with their day-to-day function, and that requires continued treatment. That's verbatim what your utilization review people want to hear to continue to give you more sessions. If you're doing psychotherapy, you can absolutely put that in. I could say that our session goal was working on coping skills, and some of the interventions on that were giving support, encouraging them to ventilate their feeling and looking at sources of feelings. Okay. And then I can move on to counsel. Or maybe we did stress reduction techniques. And then I can finish that note. I can put whatever diagnosis I want in, service codes. I can create lab orders from here. You can enter your private notes for psychotherapy because, now folks are able to request their notes. And so you want to make sure that you don't include information that what is psychotherapy notes, right? So only 3 note type exceptions. Somebody's asked about that. Only 3 exceptions: psychotherapy notes, notes that would do harm, and notes that are going to be used in or could potentially be used in civil or criminal court cases. And I'm going to go ahead and compile and preview. And it will notify me when it's complete. And so it's compiling my note. And then it looks like I spent all day on this note. Really robust note there. Then I can electronically sign it. I could copy this to the clipboard. This is for folks that are using other EMRs. I could download it and print it as well. I go back to the chart face. Another feature that we have in ICANotes that really is we do have an Ambient Scribe. So that's one nice feature. If you don't want to type and you don't want to use the buttons, then we have the Ambient Scribe in ICANote Plus now. And so I can works if they're in person or in telehealth. So it will start listening. It will create the note for you. Now, our Ambient Scribe's a little bit different than other Ambient Scribes on the market. Let me explain why. A lot of those are not created by clinicians. So our Ambient Scribe is clinically humble. It lists a lot of the protective factors. As you could tell in the way I'm talking, I'm the compliance person for ICANotes, right? I'm the chief clinical and compliance officer with ICANotes. So I'm always worried about clinicians and making sure that they stay safe as far as liability and as far as reimbursement. And so one of the things is it's really good to put a lot of protective factors in your note, right? Because you may have the best short-term goals in the world on a treatment plan for your client, and they just might not decide to do them, right? And we don't ever want to talk about things that can happen in mental health when you're treating mental health patients. It's not something we like to discuss, those adverse outcomes, but we do want to make sure that we protect clinicians. And so that's making sure that everything that you say to that client is pulled into the note as far as keeping them protected and safe and showing that you've done your best job in doing that. A lot of ambient scribes don't highlight that. We do. Another thing that our ambient scribe does is we don't keep the recording. A lot of ambient scribes out there, they'll keep that recording. I've worked for a law firm. We protected clinicians. Was before I came to ICANotes. I know that having a recording is a heyday session for an attorney. So they would absolutely love that. We do not keep the recording on that, and we don't keep the transcript either. You get to look at the transcript, and the transcript is there until you create the note. But once basically, we don't keep the recording, and we only keep the transcript for 72 hours until you compile the note, and then you have your note. Because if anything ever comes up later on in a liability situation, you don't want that recording. You don't want that transcript. You want your note to be what shines through. So anyway, that's what makes our ambient scribe a little bit different. And that is ICANotes Plus. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer that. But again, thank you for your time today. Clinicians are out there fighting the good fight right now in these hard times. And you are on the absolute front lines. And I just want to thank you for everything that you do, because we know at ICANotes that your job is not easy. And our goal is to try to make it as easy as possible. Thank you so much. Y'all have a wonderful day. Take care.